My name is Ann Rimler. I'm the president of the Boynton Beach Historical Society. We have tonight's program on Marjory Stoneman Douglas and Rachel Carson. And then in 1 month, on April 22nd, we have our last program of our season. We will hear a talk from Tommy Stroud about the Lake Work Drainage District. That's also our annual meeting. For tonight, I will introduce Bob Taylor, who is our program chair, and he will be introducing our speaker. And I will be.
Could you turn it down just a little?
I will be muting everyone's volume. If you have questions, you can enter them in chat or you can ask them at the end. We'll make sure that we go through chat and answer all those questions. So again, welcome, and I'll introduce Bob Taylor.
Thank you very much, Ann. Before turning this evening's program over to our guest speaker, Betty Jean Steinshauer, I'd like to share a brief biographical sketch of her remarkable literary career. Betty Jean was born in the Missouri Ozarks, first in her family to graduate from college. She worked her way through undergraduate school on a speech and debate scholarship. After doing her graduate thesis on Virginia Woolf and working as a speechwriter in Washington, D.C., she became a literary historian and award-winning Chautauqua speaker, touring 43 states and Canada with her one-woman shows of famous authors. Willa Cather Speaks is the most popular and often referred to as tour de force theater and life-changing. Betty Jean became a fellow in 2004 in Florida Studies at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, working for 20 years on a book about women authors in Florida, originally requested by the editors of the History and Culture series published by the University Press of Florida. In 2020, Betty Jean received the International Book Award in Biography from the American Book Fest for Long Road from Red Cloud, her book about Willa Cather. She has also portrayed Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sarah Owen Judith, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Marjory Kinnan Rawlings, Gertrude Stein, Flannery O'Connor, and made Marjory Stoneman Douglas, doing years of primary research, drawing on the author's correspondence, personal history, writings, and travel to bring each fully to life. Betty Jean writes poetry and fiction when she is not busy chronicling human life through live presentations and essays. With those remarks as a backdrop, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce and turn the program over to Betty Jean.
Thank you, Bob. My goodness, that was wonderful. I'm going to try to get my, I added some slides this afternoon in Boynton Beach's honor, because there is a local connection. And Ann had asked me when we did our, let's see, there's a copy of, yes, there's a cover of my book. I wondered where that slide went. This is, these are the authors who are currently in the books. Not all of them have I portrayed. Constance Fenimore Wilson, Zora Neale Hurston, obviously, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Rose Wilder Lane, Elizabeth Bishop, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and Rachel Carson are outside my Chautauqua repertoire, but I had to have them in the book because they are germane to discussions of Florida and its effect on writers. So just for a minute, I want to, in case there are any local history sleuths in the audience, I wanted to put a bee in your bonnet about. Here are all the pictures. There may be one more coming in. Connie Mae Fowler, if she decides that she wants to be in the book, as she puts it, she's the only one who ain't dead that I am considering, and she would bring it full circle into the 21st century, not only with her writings about the importance of St. Augustine in the civil rights era, but also the importance of what's been happening with our environment here. With she was living right on the edge of Alligator Point when the Deepwater explosion happened. So I'm really hoping to have Connie in the book as well. But this is Edna St. Vincent Millay and her husband Eugene Boissevin. The horse on the right was a very famous horse at Hialeah, not far from you. This horse's name was Shaladon. Now, Miss Millay had to keep her interest in Florida horse racing secret from her mother and sisters because her father had left the family because of his gambling debts. So Edna St. Vincent Millay actually owned part interest, at least, in 22 horses with a man by the name of W.L. Braun, B-R-A-N-N. They ran at Hialeah. Mr. Braun had a string of horse farms up in Maryland. You can probably find many local history pictures of Hialeah. The overall name of his farm in Maryland was Glade Valley Farms. Mrs. Braun was a Vreeland. That's a famous name in New York circles. Her first name was Mabel. I hope you're taking notes. If anyone has ever met or knows of Mabel Vreeland Braun, she died in, I believe, 1968. He died in 1950. Millay died in 1951. And Shaladon didn't die until 1958. So the horse outlived them. There, you know, of course, just because you read something in the newspaper doesn't mean it's true. This says that Shaladon won the Kentucky Derby. No, Shaladon actually won the Preakness. But Shaladon at that point was so beloved in Baltimore that in the bars that night, they sang Shaladon, oh Shaladon, to the tune of Oh Maryland. But these are the names of at least 6 of the horses that Edna St. Vincent Millay named, all of whom I believe were in Florida most winters. Vincentive, Steepletop, which of course is the name of her farm in New York where she died, the Millay, Harpweaver, which is the name of one of her poetry books, Eugene, which is her husband's name, and Savage Beauty, which is interesting. Her biographers pretty much ignored her connections at Hialeah, except one of them did name his book about her, Savage Beauty. So let me know if anyone, and please give out my email address to anyone who asks for it, because I would love to have some local history help. And I'd love to have a picture of his William L. Braun, B-R-A-N-N, and his wife's name was Mabel Vreeland Braun. So I just spent a wonderful afternoon with the students over in a 4 or 5 county area on the other side of the state. The wonderful Southwest Florida College had me in on campus virtually this afternoon. And of course, when I'm talking to students, I always try to remind them of the woman for whom the very famous high school in Parkland was named. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, home of the Eagles, which will become more germane to this discussion as we go on. This is the Grande Dame herself, lived to be 108. Note the logo of the high school with the eagle on it was, this is pre 2018. This is what after they lost 17 of their fellow students and teachers in a very tragic shooting there, this is what their logo became. A much more fierce eagle there, you can see, which I'm sure made the kids stronger. And they also took to the streets of Washington, D.C. To become activists if they hadn't been already. And of course, they had the perfect role model for activism, Marjory Stoneman Douglas. I was there with them in the streets. I had just found out I had stage 4 cancer, so it was bittersweet to be there. And I took Marjory's own words to make my placard: be a nuisance where it counts, do your part to inform and stimulate the public to join your action. Be depressed, discouraged, and disappointed at failure and at the disheartening effects of ignorance, greed, corruption, and bad politics, but never give up. Of course, she was talking about her beloved Everglades when she was saying that, but she was a perfect role model for the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School to become activists. The other author we're going to be discussing this evening also has at least one school named after her. Rachel Carson has a middle school in Fairfax County, Virginia, named for her, home of the Panthers. Isn't that wonderful that we have the Eagles and the Panthers here? That's not a Florida Panther, obviously, but I like that the students of the new school got to choose who their school would be named for. It was a draw between Rachel Carson and Carl Sagan, and they had to take a tie-breaking vote, and Rachel Carson won. Isn't that wonderful? But this, of course, is Rachel Carson's best memorial, birds. I actually took this picture. I took the picture of the Everglades too. I saw these gulls. I know them well. I'll know them when I hear their voices. I want you to hear their voices, because of course the book, the Rachel Carson book, is Silent Spring. And thankfully we don't have to have a silent spring, because we still have migrations of wonderful birds. These are snow geese. I knew it would come to me because of her. I shared this poem to Snow Geese by Mary Oliver with the students to inspire them to write their own poetry and journal entries about the world around them. Of course, Mary Oliver came to Florida a great deal. I last saw her on Sanibel a couple of years before she died. She's, of course, very famous for her wild geese poem, but this snow geese poem is also wonderful. Oh, to love what is lovely and will not last. What a task to ask of anything or anyone. Yet it is ours, and not by the century or the year, but by the hours. One fall day I heard above me, and above the sting of the wind, a sound I did not know, and my look shot upward. It was a flock of snow geese, winging it faster than the ones we usually see, and being the color of snow catching the sun. So they were, in part at least, golden. I held my breath, as we do sometimes, to stop time, when something wonderful has touched us, as with a match which is lit and bright, but does not hurt in the common way, but delightfully, as if delight were the most serious thing you ever felt. The geese flew on. I have never seen them again. Maybe I will someday, somewhere. Maybe I won't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that when I saw them as through the veil, secretly, joyfully, clearly. So perhaps some of you will be inspired to write poetry about the world around you. Now, this officially begins our program about these two women who wrote the books that changed the world. We began in October of 1945 in a place called Hawks Mountain, Pennsylvania. This looks like Rachel Carson is just on an ordinary birdwatching trip. This is one of the favorite places, even back then, for people to see the migrations of the fall migrations of hawks and eagles. But Rachel Carson had not climbed Hawks Mountain just to study migration patterns. She already knew that birds were dying all over the country, from Michigan and Wisconsin to Pennsylvania and Maine, all the way down to Florida. Something was poisoning the land and air. But her specialty at that time was oceans. She was a marine biologist. Marjory Stoneman Douglas, on the other hand, was still researching her book, Rivers of America, the Everglades River of Grass. Both of these women had written about Florida before, Douglas for her father's newspaper, the Miami Herald, and Carson in Transatlantic Magazine, both strictly for money. Neither had any idea in the 40s that their work would take on such importance in a fragile world. And we're going to start now a pre-taped segment of about 12 or 13 minutes that I made for a wonderful group in Maryland, about 10 miles from Rachel Carson's house, who asked me to do, actually originally had the idea for this combination for this program. And I can't say it any better than I could say it then. In fact, I think my voice was a little bit stronger then because I was only a couple of years into this. I'm now in the 6th year of 2 to 5 year prognosis. So I'm still here, like Jimmy Carter. I'll hope to stay alive a lot longer than my prognosis, but this will save me a little breath, so I'll be able to answer questions at the end. So enjoy this. I couldn't possibly do it any better. There are a couple of typos, but they'll go by so fast you won't notice. Marjory Stoneman Douglas and Rachel Carson were contemporaries and kindred spirits who appear never to have met each other. One reason for this may be that they were natural competitors for publishing contracts and book sales. So how did Marjory Stoneman Douglas come to coin the phrase River of Grass? It all began with this woman, a Canadian named Constance Lindsay Skinner, who started the Rivers of America series for which the Everglades River of Grass was written. A writer herself who had contributed 3 volumes to Yale's Chronicles of America series, Skinner determined that the works should be literary, not historical, and written by poets and fiction writers from the individual river domains. Thus, Edgar Lee Masters wrote the Sangamon, Wilma Dykeman wrote the French Broad, Robert P. Tristram Coffin wrote Kennebec, and so on. Marjory Kinnan Rollins had been invited to write the St. Johns River book, but she had just won the Pulitzer Prize and was deemed too important to do a series book. Florida eventually had 4 books in the series out of 65 volumes. Marjory Stoneman Douglas told her friend at Cross Creek in 1941 that she thought the Everglades book would take about 6 months' worth of research. It was more like 6 years before the book was released in November of 1947, timed for 1 month before President Truman was arriving for the opening of Everglades National Park. Starting in 1930, Marjory had been one of 2 women on the committee tasked with convincing Congress to pass the bill authorizing an Everglades National Park. The other was Florida's first female U.S. representative, Ruth Bryan Owen. She co-sponsored the bill, which took more than a decade to be fully funded because of the Great Depression. Prior to 1930, Marjory had been fairly clueless about the implications of what was being done to the Everglades, from the building, or as she later called it, the dynamiting of the Tamiami Trail in the 1920s, so that tourists could go from Tampa to Miami and never get their feet wet. During the Everglades Committee's explorations to find the right boundaries for the park, she had become aware that plume hunters were still shooting up rookeries of herons and egrets to harvest the feathers and sell the meat. Pelicans were shot for sport. She wrote extensively about it for the Saturday Evening Post in 1931. Marjory Stoneman Douglas was convinced that Florida was seeing the last of the egret and ibis, and certainly of the wonderful roseate spoonbill and pink flamingo. The law to protect them had been enacted in 1905, but the hunters persisted. She loved all birds, even seagulls. She wrote about a seagull monument out west, erected by Mormons in Salt Lake City in 1848, because they believed the seagulls had been sent by God to eat the grasshoppers that were destroying their crops. Douglas wrote in her newspaper column in 1923, "They have a monument to the seagulls, a straight, white shaft, surmounted by 3 or 4 gulls in stone. That sort of intimate monument is so much greater an addition to a city than some prominent and highly uninteresting gentleman wrapped up in a marble frock coat." There is no doubt that Marjory Stoneman Douglas loved Florida and all its birds, loved to go fishing with her friends in the Everglades, and had certainly been influenced by her father's many editorials in the Miami Herald against the attempted draining of the Everglades through dredging.
Douglas was a writer before she ever knew anything about science or water. In order to research her book about the Everglades, she had to prove there was a river in all that swamp, or as Governor Bob Graham once called it, a 1,700 square mile freshwater marsh. She could have saved herself a lot of time and trouble if she had figured out in the 1940s that the river she should have been concerned with was the Kissimmee, north of Lake Okeechobee, just south of Orlando. It would take her at least 20 years to realize that the Kissimmee was actually the headwater of the Everglades. But not only was it unpronounceable, it was also not nearly as sexy as a book with the title River of Grass. The story of how the book came to be called that is too long to tell here, but it is not scientific. It was very quickly hidden and has remained so even by her definitive biographer. Those who want to find it must look in the University of South Florida archives at Tampa and find a 1947 first edition of the Everglades River of Grass preserved in the papers of one Dr. Gerald G. Parker, autographed by the author to a man she called Jerry, known as the father of Florida groundwater hydrology. His was the name given to her by John Pennekamp at the Miami Herald when she signed the book contract, as the man who knew more about the Everglades than anyone else. Dr. Parker discovered and named both the Florida and Biscayne aquifers, and he tried to tell Marjory Stoneman Douglas more than a dozen times that the Everglades could not be called a river of grass, not even in a literary sense. He finally knew she was going to do it anyway, because she had to write a river book to get paid. I go into this in much more detail in Florida Journeys. For now, we'll leave it at that. The phrase was coined, Senator Claude Pepper used it in his speech at the dedication, and the book went through 7 printings in the first decade between the publication of the Everglades River of Grass and Silent Spring. An environmental movement was born. Yet neither Marjory Stoneman Douglas nor Rachel Carson came naturally to the role of activist or crusader. During most of the 1940s, both were just trying to make a living from their writing. Frank Stoneman, Marjory's father, had died in 1941, leaving her to uphold his legacy of trying to save the Everglades from the politicians, developers, and railroads. Rachel's father had also died, and she found herself the breadwinner for her mother, sister, and nieces. Speaking of creative nonfiction, she did her first article on Florida about a strange oceanarium just south of St. Augustine without ever actually coming to Florida. The tourist site called Marineland had been shut down in 1942 because of wartime shortages, so she did research by phone and mail. She was able to sell that piece on Marineland twice, first in Europe and again in the States after the war, when it was open for business again and Florida had become a place where she could do research for real in her full-time job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. During 1946, the year that Douglas was writing the final draft of the Everglades book, Rachel Carson was getting her first look at what would soon be Everglades National Park. Since it was still under the NFWS management, she and her colleague Shirley Briggs got to explore that sea of grass in a new vehicle that was neither boat nor dirigible, both of which Douglas had used in her research. Carson's mode of travel was called a glade buggy. Douglas prided herself on the fact that she had done all those years of research in canoes, motorboats, houseboats, rowboats, airplanes and dirigibles, and on foot behind friends with machetes, never once giving in to this scourge of the Everglades, what she called the swamp buggy. Being greatly prone to seasickness, Carson was happy to bounce along on a land adventure that might also have caused her to disagree with the idea that there was actually a river under all that grass. By 1949, Rachel Carson had grown fond of time on the water and also time in the water. This is not something Marjory Stoneman Douglas would ever have done. Not only was she not a marine biologist, but she admitted that she actually spent very little time in the Everglades, except to research the book. It would never have occurred to her to study what was in the water. This does not imply that Marjory Stoneman Douglas lacked courage. She was the first woman to join the Navy in World War I on assignment for the Miami Herald. She could face down any politician in Tallahassee. Rachel Carson was just intrepid in a different way. Not only was she the first woman to ride a swamp buggy through the Everglades, but she was also the first female to study the ocean from aboard the Albatross 3 out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. As a 22-year-old just out of college, she had gone on a day trip of deep sea collecting aboard the Albatross 2. That experience helped her solidify her life's ambition to study marine science in graduate school at Johns Hopkins. 15 years later, as a well-seasoned biologist for the National Fish and Wildlife Service, she became the first woman to go on an extended voyage aboard the Albatross 3, as if that were not enough of an earth-shaking experience. A few days before, she had returned from a work trip to the Miami Marine Laboratory, where she experienced for the first time an underwater dive. Although biographer Linda Lear said that Carson exaggerated the dive just a bit, making it sound as if she were really under the sea, wearing an 84-pound copper helmet, she was actually holding onto the ladder on the outside of the University of Miami's research boat the whole time. But she still saw the coral reef and had a light bulb moment, which made her aware that everything is connected. Similar to the epiphany that Marjory Stoneman Douglas had when she saw aerial photos of what had once been the slow, meandering 103-mile Kissimmee River, straightened by the Army Corps of Engineers and changed into a 56-mile canal, she understood that without the wetlands along the river, there would one day be no Everglades. By the time she knew what river she should have been writing about, when she turned a swamp called the Everglades into a classic book called River of Grass, Marjory Stoneman Douglas knew the truth. Never one to mince words as a public speaker, every time she was asked to speak about conservation, she said it. Conservation is a dead word. You can't conserve what you haven't got. She quoted what her friend Marjorie Kinnan Rollins had often said, "One day we are going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg of Florida." The same realization came to Rachel Carson, albeit slowly, and began to keep her up at night. She had studied red tide in Florida. She had seen fish kills. She knew that robins were dying on their migrations through Michigan and Wisconsin. She became an avid birder and served on the Audubon Society Board of D.C. On her trips to Maine, she began hearing about wildlife dying in large numbers on Long Island. Something called DDT was everywhere. She had no plan to write about pesticides. She wanted her next book to be a big one about ecology, but someone needed to write about the poison in the air, the soil, the water. She contacted E.B. White at the New Yorker and asked him to do it. He talked to his editor and wrote back that she needed to do it. She had won the National Book Award in 1952. People would listen to her. Her three-part series called Silent Spring ran in the June 16th, 23rd, and 30th, 1962 issues of the New Yorker. Silent Spring was published in book form that September. Apparently, President John F. Kennedy read the New Yorker. He set up a science advisory committee in late August to investigate in light of Miss Carson's book. Chemical companies began to threaten lawsuits, and she was called to testify before Congress, wearing a wig to conceal her loss of hair due to treatments for breast cancer. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, Kennedy's #1 unofficial advisor on conservation, said Silent Spring was the most revolutionary book since Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most important chronicle of this century for the human race. This book is a call for immediate action and for effective control of all merchants of poison. Silent Spring was denounced by many in business and the media, including the Saturday Evening Post, Forbes, and Time magazine, but stayed on the bestseller list for so long that it put the Everglades River of Grass out of print in the mid-1960s. Marjory Stoneman Douglas and her friends at the University of Miami set up Hurricane House Press to bring it back, and both books have sold steadily since. The Kennedy-appointed panel to research its findings led to the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and the banning of DDT in 1972. Al Gore placed it among the rare books that have transformed our society. We may never know the extent of flora and fauna saved by the publication of Silent Spring. We do know that without it we would have lost forever not only the robin, but the osprey, the brown pelican, the peregrine falcon, and the American bald eagle, our national bird. On the occasion of the book's 50th anniversary in 2012, Douglas Brinkley wrote an Audubon article in which he called Carson and JFK a tag team for the environment. Marjory Stoneman Douglas survived Rachel Carson by more than 30 years, although she was 17 years older. She lived long enough, indeed, to be called the Rachel Carson of Florida because of her efforts in stopping a jet port from being built on the edge of Everglades National Park in 1969. There are still beautiful pink and white and blue birds to be seen in the river of grass. Both Grand Dames of the environment received Presidential Medals of Freedom, the highest honor given to civilians. President Carter awarded Carson's posthumously in 1980, calling her a biologist with a gentle, clear voice. She welcomed us to her love of the sea, and with an equally clear, determined voice, she warned of the dangers human beings themselves pose for their own environment. Always concerned, always eloquent, she created a tide of environmental consciousness that has not ebbed. President Clinton awarded the Medal of Freedom to Marjory Stoneman Douglas in 1993 when she was 103. Eulogizing her upon her death 5 years later, he said, "Long before there was an Earth Day, Mrs. Douglas was a passionate steward of our nation's natural resources, and particularly her Florida Everglades." Famous last words. The Everglades is a test. If we pass it, we get to keep the planet. Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Knowing what I do, there would be no future peace for me if I kept silent. Rachel Carson. Marjory Stoneman Douglas.
I always go backwards at this point. Here we go. This is what Rachel Carson saw when she looked under Biscayne Bay in 1949. It haunted her until 1962 when she finally got it written down that everything is connected to everything else. She finished Silent Spring from her bed as she was dying of breast cancer. Those of you who know anything about coral reefs know that this one was already dying. You can see by the bleached out colors in it. Time magazine, among the magazines and newspapers who called her everything from a communist to a bunny hugger, finally said, before there was an environmental movement, there was one brave woman and her very brave book. This is now a part of the Everglades National Park named in Marjory Stoneman Douglas's honor. She opened her book by writing this sentence: "There are no other Everglades in the world." Those of you who keep up with Prince Charles and the royals may know that when Queen Elizabeth came to the United States to have an audience with President Clinton, her son insisted that she stop in Miami first and meet the matriarch of the Everglades. This wilderness area now bears her name, Marjory Stoneman Douglas. You can still see roseate spoonbills and snowy egrets and anhingas and cormorants, among many other birds. There's not much water left in the river of grass, but some years the Army Corps of Engineers turns on the spigot and helps with that. If you know birds, you know that this is a couple of osprey who are building a nest on top of a power pole in Florida. It was Marjory Stoneman Douglas's friend Ernest Cole who convinced Florida Power and Light to start putting these platforms. Originally, he meant it for the bald eagles, but eagles are much more private than that. They really don't don't like building nests out in the open, but the ospreys love it. So in fact, they have to have teams now who go along the highways and make sure that the nests aren't so big. They've started fires because they build their nests so passionately. So I'm anxious to get to your questions, but I do want to let the birds have the final word here. And the very meaning of the word extinct is pretty powerful when you consider that we're not just talking about these birds being put on an endangered species list. We really would have lost them for good if Rachel Carson hadn't started her crusade when she did. And because things happened slowly in the government, of course, both she and John F. Kennedy were gone by the time the Environmental Protection Agency was finally put into place. That happened during the Nixon administration in 1970. And it took until 1972 to have an all-out ban on DDT. But things happened in enough time that we were able to save. We know for certain that Rachel Carson saved 5 birds from total extinction. And I want you to hear their voices to celebrate the fact that they're still here. Of course, the osprey. American robin. The bald eagle, a quieter bird than you might expect. An even quieter one, the brown pelican. And the grand finale, the peregrine falcon. I think this bird is the fastest bird on the planet when it comes to flying speeds. I don't know about you, but I would never interrupt a peregrine. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I don't see questions in chat. If you have a question, I can start unmuting folks and you can go ahead and ask your questions. I put Betty Jean's email in chat. If you have any information for her about Edna St. Vincent Millay or William Braun or his wife Mabel Vreeland Braun.
Yes, you'd be surprised to find out what you can know from just asking local people. David Nolan, and the wonderful historian of St. Augustine, recently sent me a connection about a night that Edna St. Vincent Millay spent in St. Augustine. I had never uncovered in all my years of research because David knows everything there is to know about the oldest city. So I'm hoping that someone in Boynton Beach, Mr. Braun died in Boynton Beach. He's not buried there. I think he's buried up north with his wife. She had connections in both Connecticut. She died in Connecticut, and I believe they're buried in a New York cemetery, but he did die in Boynton Beach in 1951. So
Interesting.
there are local, he even got a New York Times obituary, but there's no picture of him. So I'd love to at least have a picture of him.
That's
He was the
interesting.
secret, he was the owner, and Malay was the co-owner of 22 horses. Can you imagine they got by with that and no one ever knew that she was his secret partner?
Yeah, I don't
A
ever
lot
remember
went on in
hearing
Boynton Beach in the 30s and 40s, I'm telling you.
that.
Are
Do
there
we
any
have
hands up?
questions?
There's one in the chat.
Who ended up, thanks, from Florence, who ended up writing the book about the St. John's in the River series?
The St. John's book was written by actually two people that Marjory Canan Rawlings knew well, A.H. Hanna and, oh, Flo, you know the man's name. Cabell, James Cabell. They did a decent job. I think Rawlings would have done better, but she was too important by that point.
Okay.
At least that's what Max Perkins said. Winners of the Pulitzer Prize do not write series books.
Sandra says, you mentioned that these two authors never met each other. That seems so odd considering their areas of interest. Can you speak more about that?
Well, I wish Jack Davis were here. Jack and I have gone on and on about this because he saw at some point in his research, he wrote the big book about Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and he swears that he saw a mention somewhere that Marjory Stoneman Douglas had read and commented on Rachel Carson's 1952 National Book Award winner, The Sea Around Us, but it wasn't important enough at the time to make note of it. So I'm still looking for that. I think it's probably possible that they didn't meet because Marjory Stoneman Douglas was a little prickly about Silent Spring. Certainly, she knew it was an important book, but she didn't take kindly to the fact that it had put her book out of print. Silent Spring stayed on the bestseller list so long that the Everglades River of Black Grass really was out of print by about I think it was 67, that the Hurricane House Press, which was more or less a kitchen table press at the University of Miami, was formed, and that brought it back into print. And then, of course, eventually Pineapple Press picked it up, and it's had lots of editions since. But I think that, I don't know if Marjory Stoneman Douglas would be honored by the fact that she lived long enough to become known as the Rachel Carson of Florida or not. So I don't know. They lived in two very different worlds, and even though Rachel Carson was in the Everglades at the time, at the same time that Marjory Stoneman Douglas was researching River of Grass, Rachel Carson called it a sea of grass. And Jack thinks that she must not have read River of Grass or she wouldn't call it that. But I just think that was her scientific term. She knew it wasn't a river of grass. Andy Hughes, who's my wonderful friend, the archivist at the University of South Florida at Tampa, just went in and found that original first edition. Again, I had it somewhere in my files, but I had lost the copy because back then we all had to stand at the copy machine and make Xeroxes. But Andy just went in and found that original first edition of River of Grass and sent me the inscription on it, in which she pretty much acknowledges that Jerry Parker told her it wasn't even a good literary allusion to call it. But she had that Indian name, Paeoki, so she felt free to call it River of Grass. But I would like to find that they met somewhere and just didn't want to talk about it, but I think they probably didn't, Sandra. It disappoints me too.
Randall, did you have a question? You're muted, Randall.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about your portrayal of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her relationship to Florida?
Oh my goodness. Mrs. Stowe is the lead off chapter in Florida Journeys. When I portrayed her, I was first convinced to do her by the then director of Florida Humanities. Back then it was the Florida Humanities Council, and they were having a Florida gathering in Fernandina Beach. And the director, Janine Farver, called me up one day and said, "We need Mrs. Stowe." This was going to be in 2000. I think she gave me about 7 months, which is the shortest research. It took me 7 years to get Willie Cather ready for the road. But it wasn't a complete trip. I think it took about 2 years of full-time touring with the great Charles Pace, who did Frederick Douglass, Mrs. Stowe, and Mr. Douglass and I toured Florida. 1 year. It was a heavenly experience to go from Bluntstown to Miami with Charles Pace in my car. But Mrs. Stowe would come in. She was very fervent, as you probably know. She was the wife and sister and mother of ministers. Unfortunately, the churches she attended did not ordain women, or she would have been a fiery pastor, I'm sure. Most entrances she came in singing, bringing in the sheaves, which is her favorite hymn at the time. And then I would end with her reciting the words of the poem that her friend Julia Ward Howe wrote, attempting to transform John Brown's body into a song that would be worthy of God. And it's always a miracle to me. I have a tape of it somewhere at the Clewiston Museum, where I would start with just a line or two. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And inevitably, whether it was little kids in an elementary school, college students, I wish you could have heard the college students today talking about these two women over in Fort Myers and Naples and Punta Gorda, such brilliant kids. I told them they're our only hope for the future. But I always made my exit, and no matter when I left in the singing of the song, the audience would never stop singing just because I left the room. They would continue. His truth is marching on. And of course, that's the song that the troops sang after it was released. That's the song that the Union soldiers sang as they marched. Glory, glory, hallelujah. And on the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Ralph Waldo Emerson and a great many others were waiting in the Boston Music Hall for the word to come from Washington that the foolish man who wrote it had signed it. She had spent 45 minutes in prayer with President Lincoln on Thanksgiving Day before January 1st came around. And by golly, he signed it. And she was sitting up in the balcony, and the crowd caught sight of her, and they started chanting, Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And of course, many people in the South didn't even know that the emancipation had happened. I think, May 20th, which is Emancipation Day in Florida? There's an Emancipation Park in St. Augustine for celebrating for the day that of course, in Texas, it was, isn't it July? When we have Juneteenth. But it was January 1st when he signed it. And of course, it meant that a great many formerly enslaved people, they couldn't leave the South, but they were contraband of war, but they could certainly join the army. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's son, Jim, mustered in eventually called the 35th Regiment. They marched all the way on foot from New Bern, North Carolina, and fought in the Battle of Olustee, if you can imagine it. Wow. It just gives me chills. History is just it's so alive to me, as if it just happened yesterday or today. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Donna has a comment. Donna, would you like to repeat that comment? Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I saw a great special Sunday on CBS, and it was very lengthy. And it's a strategy that's been going on for I don't know how many years, and will continue for, I believe they said, till 2030. And it's called the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, SERP. And it was enacted to restore portions of the Everglades, Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee River, and Florida Bay to undo the damage of the past 50 years. It'll cost $7.8 billion, and monies are coming from the federal government, environmental groups in the state of Florida. So it's very encouraging. And I looked it up, and I believe it's going to cover about 18,000 square miles. I mean, it's massive. If anyone has a chance to watch it, it's fascinating. I guess.
What's the title of it, Donna? Is it on PBS?
It's on CBS, and
CBS.
it is fabulous. It's Sunday morning. I like watching because they have often really interesting segments. And this one was I was so glad I watched it. And like I said, it was quite lengthy, and it covered, and it even showed where they were walking in the swamp and the restoration with marine biologists. And then they also took like the very small airplanes just so you could see the massive project.
Yes.
So very, very encouraging. And then there's also a road, I'm trying to remember the name of it, that stopped the Everglades from going west, I believe. I don't know. There was so much information. So they're trying to lift the road so to allow the water. I mean, it was just
Yes,
so
if it's Sunday morning,
encouraging.
yeah, so you can easily find things on the Sunday morning. Just look for
Yes.
that. I believe I saw I saw part of that was I was getting ready to go on a Zoom. But you know, that project started during Bob Graham's administration as governor.
That's
He
what it
was trying.
said.
Yes,
That's what
yes.
it said.
He was a good friend of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Even named a building
Oh,
after her. She hated
okay.
having buildings named after her. But if you're ever driving south on the turnpike, I want to go find the exact moment when this happens. I showed you twice. I showed you 2 slides of how they
Right.
turned a 100-mile river into a 50-mile path, and they're supposed to
Right.
restore the Kissimmee River. You know,
Yeah,
Marjory
they're
Stoneman Douglas
working
said
on it.
she couldn't possibly have named her book the Kissimmee River. Nobody could pronounce it. Nobody, it wasn't sexy at all like River of Grass. But as next time you're driving south on Florida's Turnpike, it's south of
Right.
Orlando, there is a moment, and I've got to find the exact location where you can look out
Right.
of your car window and see, I kid you not, the beginning of the Everglades. It's clear as
It's
day. But
it's awesome.
she had never been that far. She called, if Marjory Stoneman Douglas got north of, and she never came to Cross Creek to see Marjory, she just made Marjory come down to see her, because she called that dim region to the north. She
Mhm.
didn't like North Florida, so she never came to research it. When she wrote her book on the Florida frontier,
Mhm.
there was a hurricane that had wiped out the Harriet Beecher Stowe Church in Mandarin a couple years
Right.
earlier, and she just
Right.
repeated what she thought. She didn't even research that part of it because she hated North Florida so much.
Right.
But if she
Right.
had bothered, but yes, if we're lucky, but there is a point. I'm going to find it before the book is published. It's Bob. It's almost been 25 years now since Gary Marino told me to sit down and outline this book, and I've added. Thank heavens, I finally went long enough that I could justify adding Zora Neale Hurston to it. The criteria for being in this book is that you have to have a fairly close association with Florida, but you can't have been born here. That's the point. And so, and of course, as we now know that Zora wasn't born here. I think Dorothy Abbott was the first to realize that. She's on here. And Connie Mae Fowler, thankfully, wasn't born here either. She was conceived in St. Augustine, though, so it's a narrow stretch. But without Zora, this book would have just been, a dozen or so white chicks sitting around talking. You've seen the play. So she gives the book its gravitas. I'm working on a new program. I just met another one of Zora's nieces. I hope to have a new program on Florida Talks. I can't do any more in-person programs. It's just too hard for me to travel now. It just exhausts me. But virtual programs are wonderful because people can fly in from all over the place. The program this afternoon just excited me no ends because we had so many students who could talk to me over the Zoom and ask their questions. And we also had people from, 3 or 4 different countries, 7 or 8 different states. And so the new program will be called Zora Neale Hurston and Race Amity. And it really tells the story of Zora's friendships with white people and why they were sincere and why they meant so much to her, because she knew it was the only way any of us could really live is if we got along and actually found a way to love each other. And that started with a very important meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1921. So I will trace that. And so I'm looking forward. I'm working on that now. But thank you so much, you all, for coming. Are there any last questions? Bob, that was one of the best introductions I've ever had. I don't know how you found all that out about me, but my goodness, I'm impressed.
Betty
anyone
Jean,
else?
thank you very much. We're grateful to have you tonight with that fantastic program. I see Jonathan said, great show, Betty. Thanks to you, all of you. Bob says, fantastic program, Betty Jean. Thank you. Sandra
Yeah, and
says,
a thumbs up from Dave Barry means is high praise indeed. Yeah. So that's from Bolivar, Missouri. Jonathan is in Washington, D.C., a wonderful poet himself. And so thank you all. I love you. And keep an eye on me. As they say, there's a dance in the old days.